Right, hello viewers. I'd like to introduce Sean Lindskog, the creator of Salvation Prophecy. Thanks for joining us, Sean.
Thanks for having me. Hello, viewers.
Very good. So let's just get right to it. First question. Obviously, you're a developer of Salvation Prophecy. Have any particular games inspired Salvation Prophecy?
There is a lot, but the first one I would list is an old space game called Elite, which was probably the first 3D space game ever created. It wasn't so much an influence in terms of design, other than you fly around in a spaceship, but it was more of an inspiration about how it made me feel. It's an old game. I was a kid when I played it, and it really made me feel like this space pilot adventuring across the vast realms of space. And so I wanted Salvation Prophecy to be something like that. And I think the games we play as children kind of tend to hold a special place in our heart. We experience them before we become jaded. Before we start losing our imagination, before we critique every tiny little imperfection. We still have sort of this wide-eyed wonder about them. And so that's what I mean, when it was that kind of experience, that inspiration, that I wanted to make a space game too.
That makes sense. I like how you had to introduce Elite as if people haven't heard of it yet.
Right. Yes.
Well, maybe, who knows? Maybe someone hasn't. But if you haven't and you shouldn't be watching this, go away, go play Elite. Anyway, next question. So how much of the game's original vision is still intact? Have there been any new ideas since your original conception, and has anything been taken out from then that you couldn't fit in for some reason or another?
Well, the thing about space games is that, there's just so much you can do with them, right? If you look at the literature, the books, the movies, other games, there's so much to draw from. And so coming up with ideas usually isn't the problem. The problem usually is figuring out which ones you want to go with. But I would say that the vision has held up 100%. The details have changed. You got to cut stuff out that's not working. You got to try it. If it's fun, you go with it. And if not, you yank it out. But from the very beginning, the space battles, the planet battles, the apocalyptic storyline, and how that kind of leads into these distant alien worlds, that was all part of the core vision, and I think that all ended up in game pretty well. The one thing I think that was sort of on the precipice of either making it or not making it was that the game kind of has this kind of small strategy layer at the end. Once you rise, you do these missions, you become the leader of your faction, and once you get there, you get to sort of take over the military command. I wasn't sure if I was going to have time to get that in or not, and I actually thought about cutting it at one time. But then, when I was playtesting my game, you would get to the top rank in the game, and it just felt anticlimactic. You'd just gone through this whole kind of series of missions to rank up, and now, nothing cool happened. So, I spent another 6 months making that work.
I think it would have been a very different game without that. So I think I speak on behalf of most players when I say I'm glad you did include that.
Okay.
Okay. Next question. What are the current and future plans for Salvation Prophecy? Do you plan on making any sequels, DLC, or add-ons, or anything of that sort?
Well, right now, I'm finishing up a Linux port. There's sort of a small but growing fanatical base of Linux gamers out there. So it's in final testing now. It'll be done soon. About DLC and sequels, I love the game. I love working on it. I love making it. I love expanding it. So it depends how things work out. For sure, I would love to keep doing all of that stuff. But really, it probably all depends on whether Salvation Prophecy manages to claw its way up onto Steam or not. It's getting pretty close, but it's tough to, make a living making 3D games, especially 3D ones with like a lot of art costs, like Salvation Prophecy, as you get on Steam.
Fair enough. I think there will be more on that later.
Yeah.
Okay, so about the game, about the future of the game, are you actually open to, say, console ports to Salvation Prophecy, or do you plan on it being a PC exclusive?
I think that I really like making PC games. I kind of feel like there's just some looser boundaries. There's a more thriving indie scene. Even the hardware kind of lets you uh, do things that you can't necessarily do on console with like the memory limits and stuff like that. Like for instance, on the current generation of consoles, just all the memory it would have taken to have kept track of, all the different galaxies and the space stations and the ships, which are all moving around and there all at the same time. I mean, that just would not have worked on console, at least for this generation. So I think for now I'm pretty happy as a PC programmer. I like it here.
Fair enough. Give us PC fans a reason to laugh at console boys for a while. I'm probably going to lose a few fans for that.
Yeah.
Anyway, Salvation Prophecy is a game that surprises the player often, and it's difficult to really explain the appeal in the late game to someone without spoiling anything. Are you or have you ever been worried that most gamers might play the first couple of missions and assume that the rest of the game is going to just be a repetitive subpar third-person shooter and little else? And I apologize for using that description, by the way.
Yeah, well, you know what? It is a problem. I think you really don't get a full sense of what Salvation Prophecy is all about until you've played it for at least a few hours. And I designed the game to be this space epic where you kind of start out as this soldier grunt slugging it out on planet battles, and then you rank up and you get your ship. It's a space game, but you don't even get your spaceship until probably 45 minutes into the game. And so if you quit before that, you wouldn't even see this this massive part of the game, right?
And then write a review about how their mouths don't even move.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's a direct quote from what somebody wrote.
I know. I'll be displaying that review on the screen at this point, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's I mean, not only did that mean that person knew nothing about what the game had to offer, but obviously expected it to be a $50 million AAA title. It's which is not usually what you get on Steam Greenlight. But
no, it's not.
But anyways, like here's what I'd say about that is Salvation Prophecy does have all these different parts, and it maps this progression from this lowly soldier to this space pilot to this to this adventurer to distant planets to the faction commander, and so it has all these different parts, and it reveals itself slowly. And if you were only to play the first little bit, then yeah, all you would see is the shooter part, and yes, that shooter part, by a studio, a tiny indie studio, where the shooter is only a fraction of the game, is not going to compare with anything on any modern AAA focused shooters. So if that's what you judge the game by, you're probably not going to like it. But at the same time, you're also not going to see games that take you off many games that take you off such a expanse of different things. So it is kind of the game's greatest weakness, that it has so many different parts, but it's also its greatest strength. So I both regret that, and I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, fair enough. It's actually better answer than I expected. It's very good. Back to earlier, you were talking about the sci-fi stories, so this question kind of comes up. Having created such an extensive backstory and timeline for Salvation Prophecy, do you have any plans to use the universe that you've created in a game or anything really that's not tied to the current Salvation Prophecy game?
Yeah, I've definitely thought about it. But creating more stuff wasn't necessarily the point of writing the backstory for the game. The point of that was to flesh out the universe and the characters, so that when I created Salvation Prophecy, I knew what I was making. Even if all those bits of backstory don't play a prominent role in the game, it still influenced how I made the game. Say things like the dialogue for the characters, and if you look at something like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books, right? When you read those, you get this sense of it just being this epic world. Middle Earth is a real place with so much history, but part of that's just because Tolkien was a great writer, but also because he spent all this time fleshing out the world and the history and the characters before he started. You know, I mean, there's this book called the Silmarillion, which really details all this. It reads like a history book for Middle Earth, right? And probably only 1 in 100 people who've read Lord of the Rings have read the Silmarillion, um, at most. But because that book exists, Lord of the Rings was a much better book because Tolkien could draw on all of that. So that's kind of how I thought about writing out some of the backstory for the game.
That makes perfect sense, actually, and I'd look forward to seeing anything that comes within the universe. Okay, now I'm glad you started talking about dialogue and everything, because that leads very well into the next question, and it's a simple question. What's up with the Weir? How did you come up with them, their dialogue? Yeah, what's up with them?
Well, so the Weir are these, they're kind of these android robots. They're created to be scientists, right? But the problem was that you know, robots don't think very creatively. So their backstory is that the scientists who created them tried fusing in DNA from humans into their brains, their neural networks, in order to give them creative thought. But that totally backfired, and they became creative, but they also inherited all of mankind's like neuroses and insanity. So basically, they're these completely crazy, insane, intelligent science robots, and they were really, really fun to write. About where the dialogue came from, I when I was making Salvation Prophecy, it was, you know, I mean, it was a lot of work. It was a kind of a deep hole I kind of dug myself into, and was a long way getting back out again, finished game, and that probably involved being a little bit insane myself at times. So having an insane character to write was maybe an outlet for that insanity in my own head.
It did look like you had a lot of fun writing them.
Yeah.
Okay, slightly less fun question. What can you tell us about Steam Greenlight, about the process? Was it difficult to get on there? Is it difficult to become or stay relevant once you are there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have mixed feelings about Greenlight. I mostly think it's a good thing. You know, it's kind of the power of democracy. You know, kind of putting the decisions in the hands of gamers, and that's a pretty good thing. Even though the popular vote isn't always the right vote, it's maybe better than just leaving it in the hands of a few people.
Farmville.
You're right. Excellent example. There's some line noise coming in here. I wasn't sure what I just heard, but it sounded like Farmville.
Yeah. Yes.
Like for Salvation Prophecy, it's been a little tough. You know, the game, it's doing pretty well. There's over 1,000 games on Steam, and Salvation Prophecy has been sort of pinging between about 17 and 25 from the top of the list for a while now. But the problem is that I keep getting pushed back by these games that have, you know, either these massive Kickstarter campaigns or huge release hype. You know, I finished Salvation Prophecy last year at the end of June. So it was released a couple months before Greenlight came out. So, and I never used any crowdfunding. So a lot of those big things that feed into the surge of votes that pushes you to the top, I don't have. So that's kind of a problem I need to figure out to get Salvation Prophecy onto Steam.
Yeah, fair enough. It's good to have some insight, I suppose, on it. Anyway, now this is a bit of a long question, so bear with me. But I used to follow a blog that sort of gave advice to indie developers, and I remember a piece of advice that said something along the lines of, know your limits as an indie developer. Don't be too ambitious. Some games and some genres are just best left to AAA studios and their budgets. Clearly, you never heard that advice. So, I mean, what would you say to the writer or to anyone who gave you that advice?
Where were you when I started making this game?
Fair enough, short and sweet.
It's very good advice. Something that I think people should follow. What I can say is, and you're right, clearly I didn't. I mean, Salvation Prophecy is
Huge.
my studio, it's stupid to even call it a studio. It's basically me and some guys I pay over the internet to help me with artwork. Um, and so it was a ridiculous scoped game to make for such a small studio. But I think I think the game was a big part of it was for me. It's my first indie game. I've made other games in the past for companies, but it was my first indie game, and I was really all about kind of testing my limits, figuring out what I could do, figuring out how much of this world I could create. Um, and I'm not sure if I'd do things exactly the same way again, but I'm happy how it turned out, and I learned a lot.
Okay, so it's like mixed advice there then. So I've take the advice, but at the same time, you want to push your limits, don't you?
Yeah, well, it depends how much you can handle coding the same project for 5 years or not. I guess.
Fair enough. Okay. That's pretty much all I have really to ask. So, simple open question: is there anything you want to say to the viewers watching?
Well, thanks for listening. And if you get a chance to try the game, I love hearing from people who played. It's one of my greatest joys as a game designer to talk to people who've played, things you liked, things you didn't like, things just your experience. So I have some forums at www.salvationprophecy.com. Drop by. Love to chat.
Very good. And visit Steam Greenlight.
Visit Steam Greenlight. Vote for my game.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you very much for joining us, Sean. That's everything.
All right. Thanks, Luke. I appreciate it.